They say family is meant to protect you, but for the Corbyns, their own blood became a death sentence. Every firstborn child in the family history died in the same mysterious way. This isn't a legend, it really happened. And what followed over generations is a story so horrifying, even skeptics struggle to explain it. October 12, 1979, Richmond, Virginia. The Corbyn estate sat at the end of Willow Lane, a stretch of road where the autumn leaves swirled in golden spirals, masking the gravel driveway beneath. To any outsider, it looked like a quiet, unassuming suburban home. A white picket fence lined the front yard, and a mailbox bore the faded inscription, Corbyn. But those who had lived there, or tried to, knew it held secrets that defied reason. Margaret Corbyn, matriarch of the household, stepped out onto the porch, glancing toward the school bus rumbling past. Her eldest daughter, Lillian, was homesick that day, curled in bed with a pale, feverish face. Margaret's husband, George, tinkered under the hood of the family's 1976 Ford Granada, humming a tune that did nothing to ease the tension she felt. George, "Did you hear that?" Margaret's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" he called, wiping his hands on a rag. "There, that sound. Upstairs." George paused, listening. There it was again, a faint creak like footsteps on the wooden floorboards above. Only Lillian and her younger brother Andrew were supposed to be home. Andrew's room was quiet. "Probably the house settling," George said, forcing a smile. But Margaret didn't believe him. Something about the timing, the cadence, and the way the sound seemed to linger unnaturally. It unsettled her. October 13th, 1979. That night, the family gathered around the television. A storm had begun outside, lightning flashing against the dark clouds and rain thrumming against the windows. Margaret tried to focus on the screen, but her attention kept wandering to the creaking floorboards. "Mom, can I sleep in your room tonight?" Andrew asked suddenly, his voice tight with fear. Margaret looked at him, startled. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I heard someone whisper my name." The whisper had no source. The hair on Margaret's arms stood on end. She glanced toward the hallway leading to the children's bedrooms. The light flickered once, then went out. Margaret's heart raced. "George, check the fuse box. Something's wrong with the electricity." George moved toward the basement, flashlight in hand, muttering, "It's just the storm. You worry too much." But in the shadowed hallway, Margaret swore she saw a dark figure, a fleeting silhouette, watching her from the corner of the staircase. When she blinked, it vanished. October 14th, 1979. The next morning, Lillian awoke with a strange rash on her arm. Margaret examined it closely. "It's unusual," she murmured. "Not like anything I've seen." At school, Lillian complained of dizziness. By noon, her teacher had called the Corbyns to inform them she was fainting and extremely lethargic. Margaret's mind raced. This wasn't the first time a Corbyn child had shown unexplained illness around this age, especially the firstborn. She remembered stories her grandmother had whispered late at night, of the family curse, of how every firstborn seemed to carry a mark of death. Margaret had dismissed it as superstition, until now. October 15th, 1979. Margaret decided to speak to Dr. Harold Jennings, the local pediatrician who had treated her children since birth. He examined Lillian carefully, noting a slight discoloration in her veins. "It's peculiar," he said. "Nothing infectious or allergic. It's almost symptomatic of some rare, systemic condition. But I've never seen it manifest this quickly." Margaret's pulse quickened. What do you think is happening?" Dr. Jennings shook his head slowly. "I can't explain it. Honestly, neither can anyone else." As Margaret left the clinic, a chill ran down her spine. She glanced at the Corbyn estate across the street. The windows reflected the cloudy sky like dark, watchful eyes. She had the nagging sense that someone, or something, was already watching her family. October 16th, 1979. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Margaret awoke to Lillian's faint crying. She rushed to her daughter's room. Lillian was sitting upright, shivering violently. I saw them," Lillian whispered. "The shadows. They were in the hallway. They called my name." Margaret's stomach turned. She had been hoping to deny the superstition, hoping that the Corbyn curse was a story too old and twisted to affect her family. But seeing her daughter's terror, hearing the unexplainable cries in the night, she knew it was real. Then came the sound that would haunt Margaret forever, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. No one had come in, yet the knocking continued, rhythmic, deliberate, almost sentient. Margaret froze. "Who's there?" she called, voice shaking. Silence, then a whisper. "Firstborn." October 17th, 1979. The house was quiet, too quiet. George had fallen asleep in the living room, exhausted from a day of work and worry. Margaret tiptoed to Lillian's room only to find it empty. Panic surged through her chest. "Lillian?" she screamed. A cold breeze brushed past her. The bedroom door slammed shut on its own. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Firstborn." "Follow." Margaret stumbled backward, heart hammering. Through the crack in the window, she glimpsed a shadowy figure standing beneath the oak tree in the yard. Not human, not fully. And it seemed to grin. Her scream echoed into the night as the wind carried it down Willow Lane. No one would sleep that night, not truly. And for the Corbyns, the firstborn's fate was only beginning to unfold. October 18th, 1979, Richmond, Virginia. The Corbyn house was quiet, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. Margaret had barely slept the night before, haunted by the whispered word that had echoed through the empty halls. Next, Lillian, pale and feverish, had returned to her bed after being found hiding under the living room couch, trembling and whispering about shadows that moved on their own. George tried to reassure her. "It's just a phase, Margie. Kids imagine things," but Margaret knew better. She had seen the fear in Lillian's eyes, the fear of something real. By mid-morning, small, inexplicable incidents had begun. The telephone rang repeatedly despite no one calling, each time producing only static. The family cat, Simon, hissed at corners of the house where nothing appeared to exist. And then there were the footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoing on the old hardwood floor, always when no one was moving. October 19th, 1979, Andrew. Lillian's younger brother came running into the kitchen, eyes wide. "Mom! Mom! Someone's in my room!" Margaret rushed to him, but found the room empty. Nothing had been disturbed, except for a single chair, overturned as if someone had sat and stood abruptly. George frowned. "There's no one here, Andrew. You're imagining things." But Margaret knelt, brushing her hand across the floor. Something sticky and cold smeared on the floorboards. Not blood, not yet. But the sensation made her stomach turn. Her grandmother's old warnings rang in her mind. Stories of the Corbyn curse often mentioned small, almost imperceptible signs before disaster struck. Footsteps, whispers, shadows that moved when the light was off. Margaret had always dismissed them as folklore. Now they were undeniable. October 20th, 1979. By evening, the Corbyn house seemed alive. Lights flickered in rooms no one occupied. Doors opened and closed without touch. The family television turned on by itself, static-filled images flickering across the screen. "Did anyone turn on the TV?" George asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Margaret said, her voice tight. "I didn't even plug it in tonight." From the shadows of the hallway came a soft thud. Then another. Step by step, down the hall toward the living room. Margaret held Lillian close, rocking her gently. "Mom, Mom, they're here," Lillian whispered, voice barely audible. "Who, baby? Who's here?" "The shadows. They watch me." October 21st, 1979. The Corbyns tried to sleep, but sleep had abandoned them. Margaret sat in the living room, notebook in hand, documenting everything. She wanted proof that something beyond natural explanation stalked her family. Faint scratching came from the walls. Margaret grabbed a flashlight and traced the sound to a spot near the staircase. There, etched into the wallpaper, were small, deliberate marks. Scratches, letters. She squinted. The pattern was indistinct, but she could swear she read a single word. "First?" A thunderclap shook the house. The light went out. In the sudden darkness, Margaret felt the unmistakable presence of something watching her. "George, wake up," she whispered, panic rising. He groaned but opened his eyes. "What is it?" I don't know. It's like they're here, watching." From the corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the wall, tall, thin, and almost humanoid, yet somehow wrong. It didn't move naturally. Its limbs twitched at angles that shouldn't have been possible. And it smiled. George froze. Margaret clutched Lillian, who had buried her face in her mother's chest. The shadow whispered almost gently. "Next." Firstborn. October 22nd, 1979. The following day, Margaret attempted to speak with neighbors, hoping for some rational explanation. But Willow Lane was quiet. Too quiet. One neighbor, Mrs. Hendricks, peered cautiously from her window. "You've always been odd, Mrs. Corbyn," she said carefully. "But now, your children, they shouldn't be here alone. Strange things. People disappear around here. You should leave while you can." Margaret felt the words like a cold hand on her shoulder. "Disappear?" she repeated. Mrs. Hendricks shook her head. "Why would anyone make this up?" "People talk, but some things you can't explain." October 23rd, 1979. Margaret returned home with groceries. The front door was ajar. The house smelled faintly of sulfur and old smoke. Panic surged through her as she called for George and the children. Silence. She stepped inside. Lillian's doll lay in the middle of the hallway, its eyes staring unnaturally bright. On the wall behind it, scratched in fresh lines, was another word. "Nextborn," Margaret screamed. Footsteps pounded above. She ran up the stairs to Lillian's room, empty. Andrew's bed was unmade, his blanket tossed aside. A small wet trail led to the attic door. The attic, a place the children had never dared enter. Margaret hesitated, trembling, hand on the doorknob. She heard faint whispering from inside. "Firstborn." October 24th, 1979. Late night, George joined her in the attic. They slowly opened the door. Dust swirled in the flashlight beam. The attic seemed empty until they noticed the walls. Drawings, strange symbols, some resembling letters, some abstract, all pointing to a single chilling theme. Firstborn. Margaret traced her fingers across one of the marks. A cold wind surged, extinguishing their flashlight. In the black, a figure emerged, humanoid but grotesque in proportion, looming over them silently. George grabbed Margaret's arm. "We need to leave now." As they turned, the figure vanished, but not before a whisper echoed in their ears. "Next is coming." October 25th, 1979. The Corbyns barricaded themselves in the living room. They couldn't call for help. The telephone lines were dead. Outside, the storm raged. Lightning revealed glimpses of shadows in the windows. Always watching, always waiting. Lillian clutched her mother's hand. Andrew trembled silently. George tried to stay calm, but his hands shook. Margaret wrote in her journal, "Every firstborn in this family. Doomed. There is no explanation. Something follows us. We are next." From the corner of the room, a small scratching began again, growing louder. A shadow moved along the wall, detached from the furniture, stretching impossibly toward them. Then, a voice, hollow and chilling, whispered through the room. "Nextborn." "Come!" Margaret screamed. The children cried. George tried to block the figure, but it slipped through, intangible, yet horrifyingly present. Lightning illuminated the living room for a split second. Margaret glimpsed the shadow's face, human, yet twisted, smiling as if it knew exactly how this story would continue. And then it vanished. Outside, the wind carried the same whisper once more. "The firstborn. It's coming." No one would sleep that night, and for the Corbyn family, the shadow of death had grown stronger, closer, and far more determined. October 26th, 1979. Richmond, Virginia. The storm had passed, leaving Willow Lane drenched in cold, heavy fog. The Corbyn house stood silent, but the sense of unease lingered like smoke in the air. Margaret paced the hallway, notebook in hand, recording everything she could recall from the last week. Every firstborn. "Doomed. It's real," she wrote, trembling. "George refuses to admit it, but I've seen it. I felt it. Something waits for us." George moved silently behind her, muttering, "We need answers, Margie. We can't just sit here waiting." But answers weren't easy to find. The house seemed to grow stranger by the day. Objects shifted subtly, doors opened where they hadn't been touched, and the whispers from the shadows grew louder, almost conversational. October 27th, 1979. Margaret decided to investigate the attic further. Armed with 2 flashlights and George reluctantly in tow, she ascended the narrow staircase. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the rafters like skeletal fingers. The walls were covered in symbols, drawings, and words that seemed to shift slightly whenever she looked away. One phrase repeated endlessly: "Firstborn. Doomed. Watch. Wait." Margaret felt a cold chill, as if the air itself was warning her. She noticed a section of the floor that seemed slightly uneven. Kneeling down, she pressed the boards and found a hidden latch. George helped her lift it, revealing a narrow crawl space. Inside, there were old trunks, yellowed papers, and photographs. Margaret's heart skipped. The photos were decades old, showing Corbyn children, each firstborn, from as early as 1890. The pattern was horrifying. In every photograph, the firstborn child appeared pale, eyes dark, always in the same pose, almost as if they were waiting. She picked up a small notebook, fragile with age. Flipping through it, she read entries detailing sickness, mysterious deaths, and whispered warnings. October 12, 1891. Edward, the firstborn. Fever took him. Shadows watched at night. Why can't we stop it? November 3rd, 1913. Mary, firstborn, gone. Mother swears she saw figures outside the window. July 7th, 1945. Thomas, firstborn, never returned from the attic. Laughed and whispered before disappearing. Margaret dropped the notebook, her hands shaking. George's face had gone pale. This has been happening. Forever? He whispered. Margaret nodded slowly, swallowing bile. It's a curse. And now it's Lillian's turn. October 28th, 1979. That night, Margaret attempted to keep Lillian awake, hoping the presence would not strike while her daughter slept. But exhaustion overtook them all. George dozed in the living room, and Margaret finally laid down beside Lillian, holding her trembling hands. At 11:03 p.m., a subtle tapping began at the window. Not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate. Lillian froze. They're here, she whispered. They're waiting. Margaret tried to calm her. Who, baby? Who's waiting? The window pane rattled. Shadows outside moved unnaturally. And then a voice, soft, melodic, and impossible, spoke her daughter's name. Lillian. Firstborn. Margaret's blood ran cold. She grabbed Lillian and George, whispering urgently, "We have to leave. Now." George hesitated. Where? The roads. They're flooded. And even if we leave, what if it follows us? Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The house was no longer safe. October 29th, 1979. Margaret searched the hidden attic crawl space again, desperate for anything that could explain the curse. She discovered a small, dust-covered chest she hadn't noticed before. Inside were journals, letters, and a ceremonial dagger, its blade rusted but sharp. One journal belonged to a man named Alistair Corbyn, dated 1783. The entries were disturbing. The curse has been passed through firstborns for generations. Every attempt to break it has failed. They come for the firstborn, always. We hide them, we protect them. Yet still, they are taken. Another letter written in 1821 warned, "Mark the house. Watch the shadows. If the firstborn is alone, the watchers strike. There is no mercy for the chosen." Margaret read aloud, voice trembling. George. We can't fight it. It's bigger than us. It's always been here. George gritted his teeth. Then we run. We leave Richmond, take the kids, anywhere. But as they prepared to leave, Lillian screamed. October 30th, 1979. The family rushed toward Lillian's bedroom. The door slammed shut, trapping Margaret outside. George tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Inside, Lillian stood facing the corner, murmuring words Margaret didn't understand. Firstborn. Follow. Shadows. The air grew cold. The floorboards groaned, and then a dark figure emerged behind Lillian. Its form shifted, neither fully human nor fully shadowed. It reached toward her slowly, deliberately. Margaret pounded on the door. Lillian, run! Don't listen to them. The figure froze, then tilted its head, as if acknowledging Margaret's warning. But Lillian didn't move. She stood rigid, eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving in a silent chant. George's voice cracked. Margaret, what do we do? Margaret could only shake her head, helpless. The shadow's whisper filled the room. Firstborn. Chosen destiny. October 30th, 1979. Police arrived after a frantic call from a neighbor who heard the children screaming. By the time they reached the house, the Corbyns were huddled together in the living room. Lillian was unconscious but alive. Officers noted nothing unusual, dismissing the family's claims as stress-induced hysteria. Margaret tried to explain the history, the curse, the shadows, but they would not listen. Why would anyone invent something like this? She whispered to George. Why would anyone? They didn't answer. They couldn't. Something in the house remained unseen but palpable, waiting. October 31st, 1979. Margaret returned to the attic alone, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. She examined the hidden journals and photographs once more. A photograph caught her eye, a group of firstborn children from various generations, all staring at the camera. But one figure was missing. Lillian. Margaret's stomach turned. The realization hit her. The curse was active again, and Lillian was the next target. Then a whisper floated down from the rafters, unmistakable and ice-cold. The firstborn. Belongs to us. The attic door slammed shut behind her. The shadows moved closer, and for the first time, Margaret understood the horrifying truth. The Corbyn curse was not just history. It was alive, patient and waiting for its next victim. The journals, photographs, and strange symbols revealed one terrifying fact. Every attempt to break the curse failed. It wasn't just superstition, it was a legacy of death. And Lillian, the current firstborn, was now trapped in a cycle that had haunted the Corbyns for nearly 2 centuries. Outside, the wind carried a whisper through the trees of Willow Lane. Next born. Follow, forever. No one could escape. The watchers were patient. And the Corbyn family's nightmare was only just beginning. November 1st, 1979. Richmond, Virginia. The Corbyn house was suffocatingly quiet. The events of the previous week had left the family exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly fractured. Lillian remained under Margaret's watchful eye, pale and withdrawn, her small hands often trembling. Andrew refused to sleep alone, whispering about the shadows that watch, while George patrolled the house with a baseball bat, every creak of the floorboards setting his nerves on edge. Margaret's journal was open before her. She wrote feverishly, "The curse isn't just in our blood. It's in this house. It waits. It knows when to strike." The whispers returned that evening, softer, almost teasing. A faint melodic voice repeated, "Firstborn. Follow, firstborn. Follow." It was impossible to ignore. November 2nd, 1979. Margaret attempted to confront the unknown. Guided by her grandmother's old letters and the attic journals, she had devised a plan to lure the shadows into the open and break the immediate cycle, at least temporarily. "George, we need to stay together tonight," she said, her voice taut with determination. "If they come for Lillian, we face them." "We won't run this time," George nodded grimly. "I just hope we're ready." By 10 p.m., the family had barricaded themselves in the living room. Candles flickered against the darkened walls, casting elongated shadows that twisted unnaturally. Margaret held Lillian close, whispering encouragement. "They can't touch us if we don't let them, baby." "We fight," Andrew clutched his father's arm. "But they follow you," he whispered. "We know," George replied. "And tonight we show them we're not afraid." November 2nd, 1979. At exactly midnight, the house seemed to hold its breath. The temperature dropped sharply. Candles flickered violently, as if reacting to some unseen presence. A soft, deliberate knock echoed from the hallway, then another and another. Margaret's pulse raced. She whispered to George, "Remember what the journal said. Don't scream, don't run." They feed on fear. From the darkness emerged the first shadow, tall and thin, with limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face was featureless at first, then slowly it twisted into a grotesque mimicry of human features, smiling as it observed the family. Lillian whimpered. "Mom, they're here." Margaret held her tightly. "I know, baby. But we're ready. We'll face them together." November 3rd, 1979. The shadows advanced slowly, filling the living room with an unnatural cold. Margaret recited passages from her grandmother's journals aloud, hoping the old incantations would have power. "You belong to no one. You can take no more. Leave this house. Leave my children." The shadows paused, as if listening. Then one reached toward Lillian. Margaret screamed and threw herself in front of her daughter. George swung his bat, striking what should have been solid matter, but passed right through. The shadows multiplied, forming shapes behind one another, all whispering, "Firstborn. Follow. Destiny." Margaret realized they weren't acting randomly. They were testing her, gauging fear, feeding on hesitation. "Face them," she shouted. "We are not afraid of you." The shadows recoiled slightly. A moment of eerie silence followed. November 3rd, 1979. Late night for hours, the family remained huddled together. The shadows lingered at the edges of rooms, their presence undeniable, yet somehow restrained. It was as if Margaret's defiance had earned them a temporary reprieve, Exhausted, George muttered, Maybe they can't touch us if we stand together. Maybe. Margaret allowed herself a faint hope, though every instinct screamed that it was false. We can't stay here forever, she whispered to herself, even if they're held back. For how long? November 4th, 1979. By dawn, the shadows had receded into corners and hallways, but the house was not quiet. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the walls reminded them of the unseen eyes watching. Margaret noticed faint scratches along the wooden floor, new and deliberate. A shadow moved just beyond the doorway, fleeting, almost playful. Lillian, unusually calm, whispered to her mother, They're waiting. They aren't gone. Margaret nodded, fear clawing at her chest. No, they never leave. Not really. November 5th, 1979. Margaret made a decision. They would leave Richmond temporarily, staying with relatives in a neighboring state. George packed what little they could carry. Lillian and Andrew followed, still pale and withdrawn. As they loaded the car, Margaret glanced back at the Corbyn estate. The house seemed to breathe in the morning fog, the windows dark and unwelcoming. And in one top corner window, she swore she saw a shadow pause, watching them leave. It knows we've left, she whispered. It will wait. Always. November 5th, 1979. The family arrived at a small suburban home, a safe distance from Willow Lane. For the first night in days, they slept without incident. The shadows had not followed, at least not physically. Margaret allowed herself to believe they were safe, though a cold unease lingered. The journals, the attic, the whispers. They had taught her one thing. The curse never truly ends. November 6th, 1979. Margaret awoke to silence. Expecting the shadows to have followed, nothing. Relief washed over her briefly. Then came the whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible. Firstborn. Next. Waiting. Her heart stopped. She realized the cruel truth. The shadows were patient. They did not chase. They observed. They waited. Every move she made, every attempt to protect her children, was catalogued. Their true confrontation had only begun. Margaret held Lillian and Andrew close. The house was quiet, seemingly safe. For now, but in the darkness outside, just beyond the light of the porch, two glowing shapes lingered, moving slowly and deliberately, watching, waiting, patient. We will come back, the wind seemed to whisper. Nextborn, destiny. And somewhere deep in the fog, the Corbyn curse waited for its next move. November 7th, 1979, suburban Richmond. Virginia Margaret sat on the edge of the sofa, Lillian asleep in her lap. The children had eaten, bathed, and even laughed faintly while unpacking in the new house. But the laughter sounded hollow to her ears, as if it were swallowed by an unseen weight lingering in the corners. It's not over, she whispered, tracing her finger across the faded pages of the attic journals she had carried with her. It's never over. Not for us. George glanced at her, exhaustion and helplessness etched into his face. We've done everything we can. Maybe it's satisfying. Maybe it's gone for now. Margaret shook her head. No, that thing. The shadows. They aren't gone. They're waiting. They've always been waiting. She had been awake most of the night, going over every detail in the journals. One repeated idea screamed louder than all others. The curse wasn't random. It had a purpose, and it was targeted. November 8th, 1979. Determined to understand, Margaret called Dr. Harold Jennings. She recounted the strange events, the symbols, the shadows, and the history of the firstborn deaths. Dr. Jennings, skeptical but unsettled, listened. Why would anyone invent something like this? She asked, voice trembling. He paused. I don't know, Margaret. But what you're describing? It doesn't sound like superstition. The pattern, every firstborn, the timing, it's consistent. Too consistent, so it's real? Dr. Jennings didn't answer immediately. Let's just say, there's more going on than anyone can explain scientifically. Margaret ended the call and returned to the attic journals. The truth was staring at her in black and white. November 9th, 1979. That night, the first sign of escalation appeared. Lillian began sleepwalking, moving silently through the house, drawn inexplicably toward the front door. Margaret caught her and tried to pull her back. Lillian! Stop, where are you going? The girl's eyes were glassy, unfocused, and she whispered a chilling phrase. Firstborn, follow. Destiny. George tried to restrain her, but Lillian was unnaturally strong for a 9-year-old. Margaret realized that the shadows were influencing her, controlling her actions subtly, preparing the child for what was coming. It's not just here, Margaret said. It's inside her. She carries it, just like all the firstborns before her. November 10th, 1979. Late night, Margaret studied the journals in desperation. One document stood out, a letter from 1832, written by a Corbyn ancestor named Eleanor, detailing the origin of the curse. A pact was made long ago, with forces beyond mortal understanding. Every firstborn bears the mark, and every firstborn is claimed. The family has tried to resist, to hide, to flee, but it is inevitable. The Watchers are patient, relentless, and eternal. Only one can survive, and they are never the firstborn. Margaret's stomach turned. She realized the terrible truth. The curse had a logic. It was selective, targeted, and supernaturally enforced. Escape was impossible if the firstborn remained. She looked at Lillian, sleeping lightly on the couch, her small hands twitching as if touched by unseen fingers. Margaret's heart froze. We can't protect her. Not without knowing the rules, she whispered. November 11th, 1979. The first major confrontation occurred when shadows manifested physically in the living room. They were more solid than ever before, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque faces, limbs bending at impossible angles. They surrounded the family, whispering in unison, "Firstborn. Destiny. Follow." Margaret tried to read the incantations from the journals aloud. The shadows paused, seemingly confused or restrained. For the first time, she saw the possibility of resistance. "We fight," she said to George. "We don't let them take her." But then came the horrifying revelation. The shadows did not need to touch Lillian to harm her. Their power was psychological, spiritual. They could bend reality itself around the child, manipulate perception, and drain her vitality slowly, inexorably. "It's been happening for generations," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They don't just kill. They shape the mind, the soul. That's why the firstborn always dies the same way." November 12th, 1979. In a desperate attempt to save her daughter, Margaret researched everything she could on ancestral curses, old family pacts, and supernatural protections. She found mention of a ritual used in the early 1800s to protect a child temporarily, placing the firstborn in a hidden, consecrated space while the rest of the family performed protective rites. "It's risky," she muttered, "but that's all we have." That night the family prepared. Candles were lit in the attic, old symbols traced from the journals, and Lillian was placed in the center of the ritual circle. Margaret whispered prayers she didn't understand, hoping they would buy enough time. November 12th, 1979. The shadows arrived in full force. Their whispers filled the house, pressing against the walls, rattling windows. Margaret and George held hands, chanting desperately. Lillian sat in the center, her eyes closed, trembling slightly. The air was electric, charged with unnatural cold. A figure materialized more clearly than ever before, a monstrous human-shaped entity, its face a twisted mask of the Corbyn lineage. It glided forward. "You cannot resist," it hissed. Margaret and George continued their chanting, their voices raw, trembling, but unwavering. The entity shrieked, a sound that seemed to vibrate inside their bones. For a moment, it faltered. The shadows recoiled. Lillian's breathing steadied. Margaret dared to hope. Then the unthinkable happened. The entity smiled, and its form shifted. Suddenly, it took Margaret's face. "You think you can protect her?" It whispered in Margaret's own voice. "Every firstborn dies. That is the way." "That is the law," Margaret screamed. George lunged, but his hands passed through the figure. The shadows surged, forcing them all to the ground. Lillian's eyes opened, empty, dark, and distant. November 13th, 1979. When the first light of morning seeped through the windows, the shadows had receded. Lillian sat quietly, staring at nothing, pale and silent. Margaret and George were shaken to the core. The ritual had worked. "In part, she's alive," George whispered. "But something changed. We can't fix it." Margaret's journal reflected the bitter truth. The curse has revealed itself fully. The firstborn survives only through defiance, but defiance comes at a cost. It changes them, shapes them. The Watchers are patient. They wait, and they are clever. They will not stop until the debt is paid. The family finally had answers. The curse is real, supernatural, and ancient. Every firstborn is targeted, not just for death, but for possession or soul manipulation. Temporary protection is possible, but the curse adapts. Lillian's small hand twitched unnaturally. Margaret froze. The realization hit her like a hammer. The entity had left a mark inside her daughter. Not physically, but spiritually. "George, it's not over," she whispered. "It's inside her. And it's patient. It waits." The family understood the terrifying, inescapable truth. The Corbyn curse could not be destroyed. It could only be delayed. Every firstborn would face it eventually, and the watchers would claim their due. Margaret held Lillian close, whispering prayers, tears dripping onto the child's hair. Outside, the wind carried a faint, familiar whisper. Nextborn. Follow. Destiny. And far away, in the corners of their temporary refuge, shadows lingered, patient and eternal. For the Corbyns, the battle was over for now, but the war had only just begun. December 1st, 1979, suburban Richmond, Virginia. The winter wind rattled the windows of the temporary home. Snow had begun falling lightly outside, layering the streets in a deceptive blanket of calm. Inside, however, the Corbyn family carried the weight of months of terror. The air smelled faintly of burnt candles and old parchment, remnants of the ritual that had temporarily staved off the curse. Lillian sat silently in the corner, staring at the wall, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. She no longer laughed, no longer asked questions. She simply watched and sometimes whispered to herself in a voice too old for a 9-year-old. "Firstborn, follow." Margaret tried to comfort her. "You're safe, baby. We're here. We'll protect you." Lillian's eyes, dark and unfathomable, met her mother's. For a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of the child she remembered. Then it vanished, leaving only a hollow shadow behind. "George." "It's still inside her," Margaret whispered, voice trembling. George nodded silently, his jaw tight. He had seen the signs, the subtle shifts in her behavior, the empty gaze, the occasional muttering of words they did not understand. He knew the shadows had left something behind, something invisible but powerful. December 3rd, 1979. In the weeks following their escape from the Corbyn estate, Margaret sought professional help for the children. Psychologists, pediatricians, and even paranormal investigators were consulted. Everyone agreed. Lillian and Andrew were traumatized, but Margaret knew it was more than trauma. The curse had marked her daughter. One investigator, Dr. Helen Carlisle, spoke cautiously. "What you describe, Margaret. I've read reports of similar familial curses, though mostly folklore. But the pattern, the repeated deaths of firstborns, is unusual. There's something persistent here. Something not natural." Margaret's hands shook. "I need to know if it can be stopped. If it will ever end." Dr. Carlisle hesitated. "Some traditions suggest protective rituals, but there is no proof they work permanently. The force you're dealing with, it's patient, adaptive, and relentless." Margaret swallowed. She had feared this, but hearing it aloud made it real. December 10th, 1979. Lillian's changed behavior. Margaret noticed subtle changes in Lillian. She spoke rarely, avoided certain rooms, and sometimes drew strange symbols on scraps of paper. When asked about them, Lillian would whisper, "For protection, for watching." "Firstborn?" Andrew, the younger sibling, clung to her constantly, terrified of what he couldn't see but felt. Margaret and George tried to create normalcy, school, play, family meals, but every shadow, every unexpected sound sent them into panic. Why would anyone invent something like this? Margaret murmured repeatedly, recalling the old journals. Why would anyone curse their own bloodline? The answer seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The Corbyn curse was no myth. It was history, fact, and destiny entwined. December 15th, 1979, returning to Richmond, George insisted they return to the outskirts of Richmond, hoping to reclaim some semblance of normal life. Margaret was hesitant, but Lillian needed stability, and avoiding the town entirely was impossible. As they drove past Willow Lane, the old Corbyn estate loomed in the distance, dark and silent. Margaret's stomach churned. She knew the watchers remained, patient as ever. Every window, every corner of the house seemed to hold a secret she could not forget. They're waiting. she whispered to George. He squeezed her hand grimly. We survived before. We can survive now. We'll watch each other. That's all we can do. December 20th, 1979. Despite their efforts, the curse was subtle but constant. At night, Lillian would wake up whispering in her sleep. Firstborn, next. Objects moved on their own. Candles flickered without reason. Footsteps echoed in the hallways when no one was there. Margaret began keeping a nightly journal, documenting every anomaly. One night she wrote, "We are alive, but we are marked. The curse is patient. It watches, waits, and studies. Lillian is not safe, not truly. The firstborn carries its shadow, and that shadow does not forgive." George read the journal over her shoulder. We can't live like this forever. Perhaps not, Margaret replied, but we survive as best we can. For now. January 5th, 1980. Months passed, but the family's world remained fractured. Lillian rarely smiled. Andrew was fearful, sometimes refusing to leave Margaret's side. George grew tense, hypervigilant. Margaret herself began seeing shadows at the corners of her vision. Hallucinations, or reminders of what lurked beyond reality. She didn't know. The family tried therapy, travel, normal routines, but the curse had left its mark. Every firstborn in the Corbyn lineage, for centuries, had suffered similarly: insomnia, psychological distress, subtle but unshakable dread. The curse was not just physical, it was psychological, spiritual, and eternal. Why did it choose us? Margaret wondered aloud, staring at the snow falling outside. Why now? No answer came. Only silence and waiting. February 14th, 1980. On Valentine's Day, Lillian drew a picture on a scrap of paper, a shadowy figure looming over a small child. Beneath it, the word, "Next." Margaret's heart stopped. She recognized the symbol from the journals, the same marking that had appeared in the attic years ago. It was a warning, or a claim. George tried to soothe her. It's just a drawing. She's a child. Children draw scary things. Margaret shook her head. No, she drew exactly what happened before. And what will happen again if we aren't careful? The curse is patient, George. It's waiting. March 1st, 1980. The family developed routines. Doors double-locked, windows covered, nightly prayers, and constant vigilance. The shadows never returned physically, but the psychological terror persisted. Lillian occasionally froze, staring at empty corners. Andrew whispered about figures watching him through the windows. Margaret and George could only reassure themselves that their constant attention provided temporary safety. We survive, Margaret reminded herself nightly, but the curse waits. Always. Patiently. Even when outside the home, Margaret sensed it, a presence following them in stores, in schools, in streets lined with strangers, a cold awareness that they were never truly alone. March 31st, 1980. Years would pass, but the Corbyn curse would never leave. Lillian grew older, outwardly normal, yet inside a quiet vigilance remained. Every firstborn in the family would carry the weight of history, the unseen mark of the curse. Margaret often whispered to her journal, "We survived." But the curse is eternal. It watches, waits, and learns. The firstborns are never safe. The shadows are patient, and one day, they will come again. Outside, in the distance, the faint whisper of wind carried a familiar, chilling phrase. Nextborn. Follow destiny. The Corbyn family had endured, but the curse endured as well. And somewhere, in the shadows of the world, it waited for the next firstborn to inherit its legacy. The end.